My husband became a named partner at his law firm and celebrated by handing me separation papers at the firm's anniversary gala. I signed every page without shaking, walked out through the lobby while his colleagues watched, and disappeared before he realized I wasn't coming back. 2 years later, when he finally tracked me down, I was the one who had nothing left to explain. My mother told me in the kitchen of her house in Oakville, the same kitchen where she'd taught me to make pierogies every Christmas Eve and where she'd sat with me through every difficult thing I'd ever faced. It was a Sunday in November, gray and cold the way Ontario gets before the first real snow, and she'd waited until my sister had taken the kids outside before she said anything. She set her tea down and looked at me the way she only looked when she'd been holding something back for a long time. She said she was worried about me. Not the usual worried, not the kind that came and went. The kind that sat with her at night. I told her not to be. She said she watched me come through the door that afternoon and I looked like someone who'd forgotten how to take up space. Like I was apologizing for existing in every room I walked into. She asked me when the last time was that I'd done something that was only for me, not for the firm's image, not for his networking calendar, not for whatever version of a wife he needed me to be that week. I didn't have an answer. I'd been working as a registered practical nurse at a clinic in Mississauga for 11 years. When Daniel started articling, I picked up evening shifts at a long-term care facility in Brampton so we could make rent while his salary was still junior associate thin. We lived on my income for 2 years before his started to matter. I paid into our joint account at TD every 2 weeks. I managed the mortgage paperwork. I dealt with the condo board, the insurance renewals, the RRSP contributions we made every February before the deadline. Daniel studied. Daniel networked. Daniel climbed. He was brilliant at it. I'll give him that. He knew exactly which people to remember and which rooms to walk into first and how to make every senior partner feel like they'd spotted him before anyone else did. By the time he made associate partner, he had a wardrobe I'd partially funded and a confidence I'd quietly built and a calendar full of events I was invited to only when it suited the impression he was managing. I thought that was just what marriage looked like during the building years. I thought the balance would shift once he arrived somewhere. He kept telling me it would. Once I make partner, he'd say. Once I make partner, things will be different. We'll travel. We'll breathe. You can cut back on the overnight shifts. I promise, once I make partner. I believed him for a long time. I believed him past the point where believing was honest, into the territory where it was just easier than the alternative. My mother asked me if he still introduced me as his wife at firm events. I told her he introduced me as his incredibly supportive partner. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said that was not the same thing. I drove home that night through the 403 inches the rain with her voice sitting in my chest like something I couldn't cough out. I kept thinking about the firm's anniversary gala coming up that Friday. Daniel had reminded me twice to dress the part. He'd said it in that tone he'd developed lately, careful and slightly distant, like he was briefing a colleague rather than talking to his wife. I should have understood what that tone meant. I'd been hearing it more and more. I was just too tired from back-to-back shifts to let myself hear it clearly. The gala was at a hotel in the financial district. Everything was polished and expensive and slightly cold the way those events always are. All champagne flutes and careful laughter and people who were performing a version of themselves for professional reasons. I'd been to enough of them to know my role. Stand beside him. Smile genuinely. Don't bring up the healthcare system at the dinner table even though I could. Make him look like a man who had everything together. He was across the room when I arrived, already surrounded by the senior partners and their spouses. He saw me and nodded in that brief way that meant acknowledged and not come over yet. I took a glass from a passing tray and found a spot near the windows. That's when I saw her. A junior associate named Claire, whom I'd met exactly once at a firm Christmas party 2 years earlier. She was standing beside Daniel with her hand resting on his arm in a way that was casual and practiced and not at all professional. He leaned towards something she said and laughed, genuine and relaxed. The way he almost never laughed around me anymore. I watched them for longer than I should have. I told myself I was misreading it. Then Daniel crossed the room toward me and the expression on his face was one I'd never seen before, or maybe one I'd been seeing for months without naming it. Resolved. Like a man who had made a decision and was ready to deliver it cleanly. He asked me to step into one of the side rooms off the main hall. I followed him. He closed the door. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope. He told me he'd been meaning to do this properly for a while. He told me the firm's expansion into the Calgary office changed everything for him in terms of what he needed personally and professionally. He told me I was a good person and he respected everything I'd contributed to getting him here, but they were at different stages now, and he needed a partner who matched where he was going. I opened the envelope. Formal separation agreement. Already reviewed, already prepared, space for my signature. I asked him if Claire knew she was the reason he'd paid a lawyer to draft a separation agreement to present to his wife at a party. He looked uncomfortable for the first time. He said it wasn't about Claire. It was about the fact that we'd grown in different directions. I asked him which direction that was. I asked if it was the direction where I'd been depositing half my paycheck into our joint account every 2 weeks for a decade while he built a career on a foundation I helped pour. I asked if that was the direction he meant. He said I was being unfair. I looked at the papers in my hand. I thought about my mother's kitchen. I thought about the 11 years I'd spent adjusting my life to fit around his ambitions. I thought about every networking dinner I'd attended in dress shoes that hurt and every overnight shift I'd come home from to find him already gone and the coffee I'd made half drunk on the counter. I borrowed a pen from the concierge desk outside the door. I signed every page. I handed the papers back to him without reading the full terms because I already knew what I was going to do and it had nothing to do with negotiating. I picked up my coat from the coat check. I walked through the lobby past 2 senior partners who had definitely heard some portion of what had just happened. I went through the revolving door and I stood on Bay Street in the November cold for about 30 seconds. Then I called my friend Meg. She answered on the second ring. I told her I'd just signed separation papers at a hotel gala and I needed somewhere to be that wasn't our condo. She said she'd have the kettle on in 20 minutes. I sat in Meg's kitchen, in Etobicoke until 2 in the morning. She didn't tell me she'd warned me, even though she had, twice, in the past year. She just made tea and let me talk until I'd said everything that needed saying. I told her I wasn't going back to the condo that night. She said the guest room was already made up. The next morning I drove to the condo while Daniel was at the office. I moved methodically. I took what was mine. My grandmother's china, carefully packed. My nursing, diplomas and certifications. My books. The art prints I'd bought over the years at markets and galleries. My personal financial documents, my laptop, the external drive where I kept everything I'd ever needed. Then I dealt with the money. Our joint account at TD had both our names on it. The balance sitting there was money I had deposited. I withdrew my half, exactly what I could document as my contributions over the preceding 12 months. I asked the advisor to remove my name from the account, which required both signatures, so I simply transferred to a new individual account I opened at RBC that same afternoon and closed my access to the TD joint. I called Ontario Health to update my address. I called the condo board to document that I was vacating. I called the mortgage company to flag that I was separating from the co-borrower, which started a process but at least created a paper trail. The utilities were in my name because Daniel's credit had been a mess when we first moved in together. 2 maxed credit cards and a missed payment that followed him for years. I'd put everything in my name to get us the rates we needed. Now I called every single one. Hydro One disconnection scheduled for the following Tuesday. Internet cancelled. I left the gas because I didn't want to be the reason someone froze, but I removed my name as the account holder and let the bill transfer to his. I called the benefits coordinator at the clinic. Explained I was separating. Asked to remove my husband from my extended health coverage through Green Shield. She told me separation was a qualifying life event and could process it the same day with documentation. I emailed the separation agreement cover page. Done. I left the condo keys on the kitchen counter with a note on the back of an old Rogers bill. Hydro and internet cancelled. Name removed from utilities. Your coverage ends today. Good luck with the Calgary expansion. I meant that last part genuinely, in the way you can mean something and also find it deeply satisfying. I drove to my mother's that evening. She opened the door and looked at my face and didn't say a word, just opened it wider and stepped back and let me in. I sat at her kitchen table and she made tea and we didn't talk about Daniel at all. We talked about the pierogies she was planning for Christmas and whether my sister's youngest was going to make it through the year without needing braces. That was enough. I'd been quietly applying to jobs in Victoria for 3 weeks before the gala. Not because I'd known exactly what was coming, but because something in me had understood that I needed a door in case I needed to walk through one. A hospital on Vancouver Island had posted an RPN position in their medical unit. The pay was comparable. The city was 8 hours and a mountain range away from everything Daniel had built and everything I'd helped him build and every room in Toronto where I'd been introduced as incredibly supportive. I emailed my acceptance the morning after I left. I gave the clinic 2 weeks' notice. Sandra, my charge nurse, hugged me in the break room and said, "Whatever's happening, take care of yourself first." I wondered if everyone had known something I hadn't been ready to see. I loaded my car with everything that mattered. It fit with room to spare. That felt like information. The drive took me 3 days. I stopped in Winnipeg the first night. Calgary the second. I crossed into BC with the mountains on both sides and my whole life in the back seat, and for the first time in years I breathed all the way in. Victoria was smaller than Toronto in all the ways that felt like relief. Quieter, greener, the kind of city where you could walk to the water in 20 minutes from most places and people held doors open not because they were performing politeness but because they actually thought to do it. I found a bachelor's suite in James Bay through Kijiji. The landlord was a woman named Mrs. Kowalski, somewhere in her late 60s, who met me at the property with a tea thermos and a binder of documents. She looked at me the way people look when they're deciding whether to trust you and then said quite simply that she could tell I was starting something over and that first month would be half rent while I got settled. I told her she didn't have to do that. She said she knew. She handed me the keys. The suite was small and bright with a window that looked out onto a garden. I slept on an air mattress for the first 2 weeks. I ate takeout from the Vietnamese place 2 streets over and applied for everything I could think of and told my mother I was fine every Sunday on the phone, which was mostly true and getting truer. Daniel started calling 3 days after I left. He called my cell. He called Meg. He called my sister. He left voicemails that started polished and professional and got more frantic as the week went on. He said we needed to talk. He said I was being reactive. He said he'd made a mistake in how he'd handled things and he wanted to discuss it like adults. Meg texted me screenshots. I asked her to tell him I'd taken a travel nursing contract in Newfoundland and didn't have reliable service. She said she could work with that. The calls slowed but didn't stop. My sister texted once to say he'd contacted her and she'd told him nothing, and also that she'd always thought he was too smooth to be trusted and she was sorry it took this long for the rest of the world to catch up to her. I started work at the hospital in January. My manager, a calm and direct woman named Helen who had clearly built her department through years of doing things correctly, reviewed my file during orientation and told me I was overqualified for the posting but that she was glad I'd applied anyway and she intended to keep me busy enough that I wouldn't be bored for long. My colleagues were Priya, who brought mango pickle from home every Friday and shared it with anyone within reach of her locker, and a man named Tom, who had been working the same ward for 14 years and knew every physician on staff by first name and preferred coffee order. They invited me for lunch on my 3rd day. They asked about my move to Victoria without prying. They told me about hiking trails and farmers markets and which coffee shop had the best window seats. By February, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt like a person rather than a function. It was at one of those coffee shops, a place on Fort Street with wooden tables and rain-fogged windows, where I ran into him. His name was Owen. He was sitting at the only available table with a paperback and a flat white, and he shifted his bag immediately when he saw me looking for somewhere to sit, no hesitation, just a small gesture of making space. We started talking about the book, which I recognized. We talked about Victoria weather and whether it was genuinely milder than everywhere else in Canada or whether locals just needed to believe that. We talked about the kind of jobs that brought people here. He was a civil engineer with a municipal firm, originally from Halifax, 4 years in Victoria. We talked for 2.5 hours. At the end he asked if I'd want to have dinner sometime. I almost said no. The reflex was strong. I had so much I was still untangling, and the last thing I needed was to carry anything new into something unresolved. But then I thought about all the times I'd made myself smaller and quieter and less inconvenient out of some misplaced sense of not asking for too much. And I thought, no. Not this time. I said yes. He chose a Japanese restaurant on Blanchard. When the bill came, he reached for it, and I reached at the same time and our hands landed on the folder together and we both laughed. I told him I preferred to split. He said, of course, and pulled out his card for exactly half without a word about it. That was the whole moment. That simple, ordinary exchange told me more than I could have explained at the time. We kept meeting for coffee, then dinner, then a walk along the waterfront trail that Priya had told me about. Owen was quiet in the way that didn't mean absent. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He remembered things I'd mentioned. He didn't make any situation about himself. I didn't tell him about Daniel for 3 weeks. When I finally did, sitting on a bench at Beacon Hill Park with geese doing absurd things around us, he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said it sounded like I'd been doing a job that wasn't your job for a very long time. I said yes. That was exactly what it had been. He said he was sorry that happened to you. Then he said, "I'm glad you moved here though." I believed him. 4 months after I left Toronto, Helen called me into her office and offered me a charge nurse position that was opening in the unit. The pay was an increase I hadn't expected that quickly. I accepted before she finished the offer. That was the week Daniel found me. I was at work when Priya came to find me in the break room with an expression that said something had happened at the front desk. She told me a man had come to the hospital asking if I worked there and whether someone could pass along that he needed to speak with me urgently. He'd given the name of my husband. I set down my coffee cup. I told Priya to let security know that this person was not to be given any information about my schedule or contact. She said already done. Helen knows too. I went home that evening and sat very still in my apartment for a while. I thought about how he'd found me. I'd been careful, no social media updates, no forwarding address, nothing. Then I realized what I'd missed. My OHIP card. My driver's license. I'd updated my address through Service Ontario online. Those records weren't public, but there were ways a determined person could get close enough. And Daniel was a lawyer. He knew which questions to ask and which people had access to what. The next morning, I called a family law lawyer named Rachel Park, whose name Helen had given me when I first started. Just in case, Helen had said. Rachel had a calm, organized manner and no patience for ambiguity. I told her about Daniel appearing at my hospital. She asked me if I'd formally filed for divorce yet. I had. Through my Toronto family lawyer before I left, citing 1 year of separation, which was the standard grounds in Canada. She said good. She also said that if he was using professional or legal networks to locate my address without my consent, that crossed into harassment territory and potentially privacy law violations. She asked me to document everything from the moment I'd left and bring it all in. I spent a weekend going through my records. Every voicemail Meg had screenshotted. The hospital security log from his visit. The timeline of my address changes. Every blocked number, every text sent through third parties. Rachel reviewed it on a Tuesday afternoon with her reading glasses pushed up into her hair and a pen moving steadily across her notepad. She said that his showing up at my workplace was enough on its own for a protection order application. She said if he did it again, we would not be having a conversation. We would be filing immediately. He did it again. 3 weeks later, Owen and I were at a restaurant in Fernwood when my phone buzzed with a text from Priya. The man came back. Security has him at the front entrance. He's asking for you again. He says it's a family emergency. I excused myself from the table. Owen watched my face change and said, "Do you need me to stay or go?" I said stay. And I told him what was happening. He stayed completely still and calm while I called Rachel. Then he called the non-emergency police line to report a harassment incident at the hospital. Then he sat with me while I shook slightly from adrenaline and didn't try to fix anything, just stayed present while I worked through the calls I needed to make. Rachel filed for the protection order the next morning. The affidavit included the hospital appearances, the documented contact attempts through third parties, the evidence of him attempting to locate my address through professional channels. The hearing was 2 weeks later in Victoria. Daniel had flown in from Toronto. He looked like a version of himself that had been running at too high a speed for too long, suit slightly wrong, the careful composure slightly off. The judge was precise and unhurried. She reviewed everything without comment. When she looked up, she addressed Daniel directly and said that a pattern of unwanted contact, workplace appearances, and third-party locating efforts following a separation constituted harassment regardless of how the person conducting it characterized their intentions. She said it was not love. It was an inability to accept that someone had left. The protection order was granted. 150 meters. No contact of any kind. Violation subject to immediate arrest. Daniel looked at me across the courtroom. He looked like he didn't understand how we'd arrived here. I thought about all the years I'd made myself smaller so he could feel bigger. I thought about the gala and the separation papers and the way he'd called it a stages of life issue, like I was a line item on a growth plan he was revising. I felt nothing that resembled what he was hoping I'd feel. I felt relieved and clear and very ready to leave. Rachel walked me to my car. She said, "You did well in there." I said I had good documentation. She said, "That's how you do it." The Law Society of Ontario notification came 6 weeks later. Rachel had recommended, and I'd agreed, to file a complaint against Daniel for potential professional conduct violations related to using his position to locate my information. A member of his firm's staff had apparently provided my Victoria Hospital name to him directly, which the staff member confirmed when the society investigators made inquiries. That kind of disclosure, identifying the personal location of a former spouse, using information obtained through professional access, fell under the society's conduct rules around use of information and professional integrity. Meg called me the night it became public knowledge within the Toronto legal community. She said his firm had placed him on administrative leave, pending the review. She said Claire, who had become his girlfriend officially after I left, had ended things when the protection order was reported, apparently not interested in the version of him that showed up at ex-wives' workplaces twice and flew across the country to stand in hospital lobbies. I sat in my apartment with the window open. It was spring in Victoria, which meant the garden outside Mrs. Kowalski's building was doing something extraordinary with purple flowers I didn't know the name of yet. I thought about how Daniel had told me at the gala that he needed a partner who matched where he was going. I thought about the certainty in his voice. I thought about how much I'd believed for years that where he was going was somewhere I'd eventually be included in. He'd been so sure he was trading up, so sure that the years I'd given were something he could close out like a file he'd finished with and shelve. The Law Society issued its findings 4 months later. Professional misconduct, suspended for 6 months. A notation on his record that would follow any application he made to practice in any province in the country. He would not be making partner in Calgary. He would not be making partner anywhere for a considerable time, if ever. I learned this through Meg, the same way I learned that he'd returned the Calgary condo he'd leased in anticipation of the move, and was back in Toronto at his parents' house trying to rebuild a practice that had quietly contracted while he was away. I learned that the firm's anniversary gala the following year had not included a tribute to his impending named partner status. I felt no satisfaction. I felt the quiet of something finished. Owen proposed in April on a trail in the Malahat with Mount Finlayson behind us and a flask of good coffee and absolutely no audience, because when I'd mentioned once that I'd always thought public proposals were more about the person doing the proposing than the person being proposed. So, he'd actually listened. He got down on one knee on the trail, and said that he'd been trying for months to figure out the right words and had finally decided the right words were just the true ones. He said I was the most quietly capable person he'd ever met. He said he'd watched me build a whole life from nothing in less than 2 years, and he wanted to be someone who got to witness the rest of it up close. He said he was not asking me to carry anything. He was asking if we could carry things together. I said yes before he finished. We told Mrs. Kowalski that evening over tea in her kitchen, and she cried in the quick way that meant she was genuinely moved and said she'd been hoping for this since the day I moved in. We got married in August at a small venue in Sonic. 60 people. My mother in the front row crying happily. My sister catching the bouquet and immediately announcing she was putting it in the freezer for luck, which made everyone laugh. Helen from work. Priya and Tom. Owen's family from Halifax, loud and warm and entirely willing to fold me in. Rachel Park came. She sat near the back and smiled when I caught her eye, and I thought about how some professional relationships become something else without you quite noticing. I thought about Daniel exactly once that day. Not with anger. Not with any particular feeling at all. I thought about him the way you think about a road you once had to take to get somewhere and now don't need anymore. He had told me I was someone he needed to move past. He'd been so sure that leaving me was the move that cleared the path to everything he wanted. What he'd actually done was remove the person who'd been quietly making sure everything worked. The mortgage, the utilities, the financial management, the benefits, the steady reliable income that covered the gap while he climbed. He'd looked at the foundation of what we'd built and decided it was weight. He didn't understand that without it, nothing stands. His practice was smaller now. His record was marked. The partner title he'd spent a decade building toward was on hold, maybe permanently. The woman he'd left me for hadn't stayed to find out what he was like when things got hard. None of that made me happy. The honest truth was that his failure had nothing to do with my happiness. My happiness was Owen cooking dinner on Tuesdays and hiking the trails behind Victoria with Priya on Saturday mornings and coming home to a space that was mine and ours in equal measure. My happiness was a promotion I'd earned and a salary I could name out loud without calculating what it needed to cover, and a life where nobody expected me to disappear so they could be more visible. I had thought for a long time that love meant sacrifice. That it meant making yourself smaller. That the person who worked harder and asked for less was the better partner. I know now that wasn't love. That was a bad contract I'd signed before I understood the terms. What I have now is different. It's ordinary in all the ways that used to look ordinary from the outside of them and now from the inside feel like something extraordinary. Two people, one shared life, nobody carrying more weight than their half. Daniel had wanted a fresh start. He'd made certain I understood that I was the thing standing between him and it. He'd handed me the papers and said goodbye to the foundation he'd been standing on. I hope his fresh start was worth it. I genuinely mean that. Mine certainly was. If this story stayed with you until the end, hit that like button right now. My favorite moment was walking out of that gala with the separation papers signed, knowing I was already gone before he realized it. What moment stayed with you? Tell me in the comments below. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one.